at long last, my video for 804 this week. And as I mentioned in that brief essay I wrote to you that I posted yesterday, I wanted to use this. You're working on your final project, and if you want to email me, call me, whatever, we can talk about that. But what I wanted to do is, we have these other sections in banks, and you can find this information about different groups: Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Jewish Americans, European ethnic groups, etc. You can find this online. It's not difficult to locate this. And it may be a little better than the information here, even more current. But I was thinking about, as we get all excited about multicultural, and as Banks mentioned in the beginning, you can do a very shallow presentation, which is fine for initially to acquaint kids with diversity in the culture, their local culture, or something they're going to be observing, maybe on video or something that's in the news. But gradually you want to get deeper, and you want to get into the nitty-gritty of culture. And that's where it gets more complicated, both in terms of both the positives and negatives of that culture, but also in terms of the culture you come from or the one you grew up in, which may have very negative stereotypes about the culture being explored. And I mentioned the example here that if we just pick the Irish, and a lot of times nobody says anything negative about the Irish anymore, but in the 19th century, it was always negative about the Irish. And you can historically look at the British treatment of the Irish, the relationship of Ireland as basically a colony of Britain, the potato famine, the anti-Catholic issues that carried over into the New World, that carried over into Philadelphia and New York and many places where there was anti-Irish, which was often connected to anti-Catholic if they happened to be Irish Catholic as opposed to Irish Protestants. And I put a little bit about that, 5 points, the gangs of New York, which I think is obviously very dramatic about the fighting with clubs and knives and horrible wounds they would have inflicted on each other. But it does show the primitivity of that part of New York. And 5 Points was a place, I guess, where 5 streets come together, kind of like Grand Island has a place where they have 5 Points Bank or something. But in New York, it was one of the worst slums, and it was a slum for Irish, maybe a few other groups there too. So in examining the past, you can find some of the reasons for the negativity toward the Irish and how the attitudes of the past caused them to be isolated in their own little group, and they tended to stay together. And they tended to be, a very poor place, which was very violent, which had nothing to do with Irish culture, has a lot to do with poverty. So that's one example. I didn't want to cite other examples because you'd say, oh yeah, I know that, I know all about that. But the Irish, a lot of people don't know about. You could do the same thing with African Americans, and when they moved to the North after the Civil War and around the turn of the century, 100 some years ago, turn of the century. And also when Jews moved into New York City, Polish people moved to Chicago, whatever group moved wherever, they tended to go together. And you can remind your students that these so-called ghettos, and ghetto is a negative term, but it was used to describe ethnic areas, that in fact, ethnic people crowded together even if they were in North and South Dakota. If you were Ukrainian or if you were Russian and you immigrated to the United States and you were a farmer, you probably wanted to go where you could grow wheat. And that was good land out in the Dakotas and Nebraska. They called them the Russian Germans, or German Russians, I forget now. But it was German people that lived in Russia who had lived there for maybe 100 years under the protection of the Tsar. But when the new Tsar came into power in the 1830s, he's changed the rules and he started making the Germans either leave or they had to serve in the Russian army. And so a lot of people said, we're just Germans temporarily in Russia, and they immigrated to the United States. You can find them all the way from North Texas all the way to Canada. And they were often associated with wheat. Hard red wheat was grown there. So you can look for these stereotypes, and you have to explore why did they come about and why did they exist. Now, there's a video in Facing History. You can go on and register on the site, facinghistory.org. And you can register, and there's a video called Ethnic Notions. Now, Ethnic Notions deals with stereotypes, caricatures, cartoons, etc., negative about African Americans. It's not the kind of movie you would show in high school, and certainly not in lower levels, because it tries to make a joke out of things, and the jokes are very hurtful. They're very racist. But I remember seeing some of these type of movies, even when I was a little kid in the 50s. They were still shown as either, this particular video you can see on Facing History is actually, has a big cartoon about music, and it shows music, but it also shows African Americans in very derogatory terms. I wouldn't suggest showing that to anyone maybe in college, because those things are very, when I say you have to be careful, you can't just willy-nilly show things and not put them in the proper perspective. If people get wind and think you're just using cartoons of one type or another to ridicule an ethnic group, then you're going to get labeled as being a racist, and you don't want that to happen. So you got to be careful with the ammunition you're using when you teach and the resources. So I just mentioned that. Same thing with Native Americans, Asian Americans. I can find cartoons from World War II that were very generally anti-Japanese, but the implication was they were anti-anybody from Asia, because the way people were drawn, the way they were shown, the way they talked was to ridicule them. So that's how others have been treated, and our society in periods in the past have been very indifferent. I could find the same argument about people with different sexual orientations, people from different parts of the country. I often cite Southerners. People show Southerners as being uneducated and talking unusual and derogatory. And the fact is, you as a teacher, even if you think something might not be so bad, think about how it's going to be in the future. And think about if you have a kid that has relatives in that part of the country. These are important things. You know, we joke about Texans sometimes. But that could be an offense. You could say some pretty offensive things. I know when I lived in Oklahoma, they said a lot of bad stuff about Texans. And then when I left Oklahoma, I met people who said bad things about Oklahomans. So even the states are on each other's case somewhat. But so when you're going to deal with something, I mentioned in here in my little list, you know, one of the things I never cared for is people say, we're going to have Taco Tuesdays or French Crepe Fridays, or we're going to have something about some culture a certain day of the week, or we're going to have Multicultural Day and we're all going to talk about other cultures, but then we're not going to talk about it anymore. We'll just do it for one day or 1 week or something in a geography unit, social studies unit. And so I'm looking at long term. I mean, what kind of books do you have in the library? What kind of, and you teach your lessons, do you include, not absolutely have to do this all the time, but you talk about math, concept of zero. Who had it? Well, the Mayan had concept of zero. Arabic numbers introduced the concept of zero. It originated, I think, in India. Romans didn't have it. You ever try to do calculus with XXIXL something, Roman numerals. Can't do it. You know, the Romans probably ran out of people before they ran out of numbers, so they ran out of people. So look around your community. Think about the attitudes in your community toward a certain group you might be talking about, and then think about how can I show the truth about that group, and find the beauty in their culture. This is everything. You can find beauty in something, then that's, you know, you're teaching something that's of value, whether it's poetry. I don't care if it's artifacts, you know, Navajo rugs, Navajo art, Navajo stories. I know I showed some of those in my books when I was showing you about, I think I had one on Navajo weddings and maybe the Navajo language. I mentioned in here that, you know, Overton, Nebraska was first colonized or whatever by, there were African-American pioneers in that area. A lot of people don't know that. I discovered that years ago. So there were a lot of, Nebraska is interesting that way. And I know you may be in other places, but certain places like Nebraska have had a lot of different groups come in. A lot of Europeans, obviously, in Nebraska, but you had Germans, and you had them over in Gothenburg along with the Swedes. And then Eustis Farnham, you had German groups there. Oakland, in Holdridge, you had Swedes. Wilbur, Nebraska, you had Czechs. Loop City area up there, I know, is Polish. There are places that I think may have been Welsh, even though there aren't as many people from Wales, or they're not quite as distinct, you know. But we do know Irish were up at O'Neill and many other places. I mentioned here, look in your library. And one time when I was at Lexham, long time ago, I looked in the library and they had one book on Guatemala. And it was really about going for vacations in Guatemala. It wasn't really about Guatemala or the people. And they'd already had a few people in Guatemala. And I thought, well, you need more books. So books are very important. Kids want to go in and find out that they also are represented in the school, in the library, not just on teams and stuff like that, but that they have a cultural continuity or some existence there. Native Americans, depending on where you are, you may not have access to people that are experts or a part of that culture, but at least historians that can talk intelligently about it. That's important. I mentioned here, you know, arrowheads and stuff, but there are Native Americans in Nebraska. And maybe you just need to look a little harder to find out, you know, who is a Native American. Because you don't want, as I mentioned before, if you have children or families in the community from that culture, try as much as you can to bring them in if they want to. I mean, obviously you have to want to share things, but bring them in to share about their culture. There's one reading in the, I don't know if it was in our book on Piper, but reading about a girl, or no, maybe it's one of you, was talking about a girl that was Jehovah's Witness and talked about the impact of the Holocaust on Jehovah's Witnesses. They were forced to wear a purple triangle, indicating a unacceptable religious group. So, and then I think I showed that to you in that concentration camp. There were all kinds of symbols that classified everybody in those, like they thought they were classifying some kind of life form they had discovered, different types. So explore cultures that are shared by your students, their background, the community. You may have people in the community that are excellent at, I have a student that does great quilters. She's very young, and she's done quilts that are amazing. I bet she's only 19 or something in my ESL classes. And she makes quilts that are art, literally. And she just said, well, I just taught myself. I learned it and watched videos. And, you know, my wife quilts and stuff, and nobody quilts like this young lady. And quilts often have a lot of history in them. So you can actually take a quilt, and if you have something from your great grandmother or something, I have some of these. They actually have material from old flour sacks that were used in the 30s. So you'll find dresses, material reused because people reuse things back then. And that's because the past itself is another culture. The 1930s was a different time than the 2010s. And people recycled everything. I remember hearing stories from my wife that some of her or different people, their relatives, and I think they were where they lived, they were German. They said you go in and people weren't hoarding. They literally were saving even their seats when they bought groceries. They saved the little pieces of paper in the thought that there might be some use for them at some point. But they all kinds of things were recycled. And that's something that, you hear about kids in Latin America, they play baseball. People will actually make a baseball. I don't even know what they do it with, but they create something. I know kids when they're poor many centuries or many 20, 50 years ago, nobody could just afford to buy a baseball from the store. So they'd use a sock or do something and they'd try to sew it up tight and they'd use it until they just beat it to death. I also bring up games, and I happen to really like games. I have several games. I've got Japanese chess or shogi, and I've got videos on here on this site. Also, I got Go, which is known as Pente in the United States, Pente. Some guy in Stillwater, Oklahoma invented Pente, but it's really based on Go, which you have all these pebbles that are nice and round, and your goal is to surround your enemy. You're white and they're black or whatever color it is, and they go first. And instead of chess pieces, you don't capture them, but you try to surround them. It's like drawing lines around them. And if you get so many lines, then you eventually win. Mancala, some of you played it. It's where you have stones and you roll dice or something and you move them from place to place. Kind of reminds me of Parcheesi. I think you can make people go back if you land on in the little place. And that's a game that was played by shepherds a long, long time ago that would literally dig holes in the ground, use stones, and they'd play a game while they're stuck out there for hours and days playing with or watching their cattle or their sheep or something. I mean, people didn't just sit there and hum to themselves. They didn't have radio 2,000 years ago, so they made up games. So you can look for stuff like that. You can even make them literally on a piece of clay. You could just lay down the game and create it. And then also in your content areas. I mean, if you're teaching chemistry didn't start in the United States. Chemistry had a long history going back to alchemists, who were people that thought they could turn something into gold. And that stuff, it's almost like magic, And so chemistry eventually came out of that. A lot of people don't know that Sir Isaac Newton was a great scientist, but he also wrote a lot of material on alchemy. And alchemy was kind of like magic chemistry. And if you do this and this, then you can turn something into something else. Well, it didn't work, but people kept trying to do it. They experimented. And it's because they could mix some chemicals and create something. Like they could create gunpowder by saltpeter and was it coal and something else. They'd mix various amounts together. You could make iron. You could make different metals like the Bronze Age. It was tin and gold or tin and copper. But there were different weapons you could make or different items you could make or even jewelry you could make. Really interesting thing, you couldn't really do it, but I always thought, was how people first smelted. That means they made iron tools. And the copper tools that they made during the Bronze Age, people literally figured out a way to make it incredibly hot little place in the ground, like a forge, like a superheated oven. And they put metal in there and they would get it hotter and hotter and hotter. And then they had a mold and they could pour the pour the bronze into and make a bronze axe head or some weapon of some sort. And it was very dangerous. I read a thing, if you try to do it, you have to be careful it doesn't blow up or you don't burn yourself terribly. So it wasn't an easy thing to do, but people did it literally out in the middle of a bunch of rocks. They were able to do this. The other things are interesting. A lot of objects we have right now. I used to have it here, and I don't know where I put it, but I had some soap that comes from buffalo. You know, we know soap came from animal fat. People would use lye soap. You know, we don't really use it much anymore. Our soap is a lot softer and nicer than that. But people would clean with soap, and they have to make soap. They didn't have an industrial production. So they'd use fat from animals and various, maybe some weeds or maybe scented a little bit. Candles from beeswax, they'd make that. But everything, I always liked it in history with archaeology. You can go back and look at ancient Egyptians. They had everything. They had combs, they had eyeliner, they had makeup. They came up with all this stuff, and they made it from natural. A real fun thing to do is to make papyrus, which you basically get chewed. You get you get plant fibers, and you pound them until you almost pound them like dough, really thin, and then you let them. Put them together and pound them together, and just let them dry, and they'll make a sheet of paper. That's something you might try sometime. You might be able to use some plants in Nebraska or someplace in the United States and make papyrus. The paper was very valuable. And how did they make ink? Well, they had plants they combined to make black ink. You could look that up. So chemistry, physics, fashion is a great one. I always thought how people dressed, how they dyed clothes. In the Bible, they talk about a woman, I forget the name of the city in the Eastern Mediterranean, but she was, the name doesn't come to me, it's in the New Testament, but she was a specialist in purple. And purple was a very, very, very valuable dye because only purple clothes were used for royalty. And they actually control what color clothes you wore. So if you were a poor person wearing purple clothes, you would get arrested. So you were known by your dye. Kind of interesting, you know. Imagine if the Kardashians ran the world. You know? Plumbing is always fun. Kids love plumbing. People always say, well, how nice was it to live in a castle? Well, you couldn't heat it. It was cold. Miserable. You had to have animal blankets. Poor people slept all in one giant pile of hay to try to stay warm. Didn't help with disease. If somebody had a bad cold, they spread it. Bathrooms, they didn't have bathrooms. In castles, they just had a hole kind of out on the edge and everything fell in the moat, which meant that castles weren't really very clean and they sure didn't smell very good. You have to go back to Roman times to get decent plumbing. And even then, the problem was the Romans had fresh water coming in, but they didn't have a way to filter to keep it clean. So when they had the Roman baths, that meant all the sick people and dirty people all went out and everybody was in the water. And I don't know how often they flushed it, but I got a feeling it got pretty nasty. So that would have been interesting. So those are things that come up. So you explore, you know, and remember that time is another culture too. We go back, we even went back to 20 years ago, things would be different. We just barely were using the internet 20 years ago. It just kind of started. It's nothing like it was now. No one would have imagined that there'd be social media platforms that can influence elections, or that you could make a fortune just by putting up videos like I would like to do of these videos. I would love to have these go on and suddenly, you know, 1 million people are watching me and I'm getting paid for it. Gosh, wouldn't that be wonderful? So I would like you to advertise for me if you'd be kind enough. But that's what, so I was thinking, what I'm going to put on some discussion is, what if these groups, and you can read through these in the book, because that's one reason I got the book, is there's information about materials and stuff. If you should decide on your project to talk about a particular group in terms of what we call ethnic group, I think that's pretty loose too. You know, think about what do you have to know yourself, and what do you have to think about your class and your school, and what is the relationship? If you're in an area where nobody knows anything about Filipinos, then how are you going to introduce Filipinos? You might talk about their place in history, but you want to talk about modern Filipino immigration in the United States, and the fact that for a long time Filipinos were basically in the territory of the United States, and it became independent after World War II. But before that, between the war between United States and Spain in 1898 and 1947 or so, Philippines was part of the United States, at least as a territory, kind of like Hawaii was, and Guam, and a lot of other places. So you want to go back and look at all that, and then look at, you know, the details of the culture. Now, you may not want to talk about Filipinos. It may not be very relevant to your community. Maybe you have a lot of Korean immigrants in your community. But you need to look also at Korean and American interaction over a long period of time. And Koreans in the United States for many, many decades, a century, longer than a century. And how did they get here, and what brought them here, etc. The same as with Germans and Irish and everybody else. So this is just my little venture talk here to get you to think about the bigger picture when you look at these groups. To respect them, to teach that there's beauty in their culture, and not to gloss over the difficulties, but not to let the difficulties and the conflict to be too inflammatory. Whether it's the cartoons or the stereotypes or the genuine conflict that occurred. You know, if you talk about Japanese Americans and Japan, and that's a complicated relationship. Unfortunately, Japanese Americans here before World War II were blamed for Japan. Japan was a purely racist thing. You look like them, you must be them. You know, in World War II, we did almost no German, other than German nationals, no Germans were rounded up and incarcerated. Very few Italians were rounded up and incarcerated. But I do know of a few. I've heard of a few. But if we'd have put everybody that was German and Italian in some kind of camp, we would have had half the East Coast locked up. Okay, so we picked on another group that wasn't quite as common, you know. So that's another issue. So I hope this has been helpful. I'm going to put some more stuff on. I'm kind of wanting to keep things pretty light. I'm going to be responding to your discussions with videos as I did on Saturday, and catch up on those. But I'm mainly interested because there's so much good stuff in your discussion. I really want to hit on that. Thank you.